Hi, my name's Kat, and you're watching Kat Rose Astrology. And today I've got a slightly different interview. I'm talking to Sam Reynolds, and it's kind of part interview, part tutoring session that I got the opportunity to have with Sam. I really knew that I had to pick Sam's brain about the topic of the daimon, especially after I watched a wonderful workshop that Sam delivered as part of the NORWAC conference earlier this year. So we cover a lot of different material, stuff that I couldn't really find anywhere else, hence why I knew I had to talk to Sam. So we go into depth about what the jinn is and what that has to do with the daimon. That was something that I was like trying to research. And I know that Sam has a great background in learning about the jinn, the places of good and bad daimon, the lot of daimon. So these are all astrological concepts, which I cover in my book, Discovering Your Personal Daimon. It was so great to have Sam's take on these things. We talk about the Almutin or the Almatin and like what that means. We have a really interesting conversation about the etymology of the word Almutin, which is another astrological term. And we also talk about how do you meet your daimon? What kind of practices that we could engage with in our lives to connect with the daimon, as well as how to remediate a difficult planetary placement. So this conversation is super wide-ranging, as you'd expect with Sam. He's a real expert on astrology and the daimon. And so I really hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. You can find Sam's work at unlockastrology.com and definitely follow him on Twitter because he's really fun on Twitter as well. And if you'd like to learn more about my book, Discovering Your Personal Daimon, which is currently being hopefully launched as part of a Kickstarter campaign, you can find the links below. It's the book where I go into my research on the daimon, from the history of the daimon, the different faces of the daimon, how to find the daimon in your birth chart, and how to connect with the daimon in day-to-day life. So find out more about that in the description below. And thank you in advance for all the support that the book is getting so far. All right. Hope you enjoy the show. Yeah. So if we just start with the jinn, because this is something that I found the hardest to research. And then when you were speaking about it, I was like, oh, wow, like, this is, I guess, more part of your like faith and you know much more about this. And I couldn't find this information online. So one thing I've heard people say, I think it was Michael Mead, said something like, it has separate origins to the daimon which makes sense.
Yes. I mean, here's what's interesting to me. So the etymology is different, right? Or putatively different. And when I say putatively, I am not debating etymological scholars, right? I will say, for the sake of argument, I trust their scholarship. But it brings up particular questions, especially as you look at how we talk about the jinn and then how we talk about daemons, right? So first, let's clear up the etymological origin. The etymological origin is, we could say, genie, when the idea of the Arabian Nights or 1,000 Arabian Nights was translated, is more for the French for genius, for the creatures who are described in that text as the jinn. So it's more seen as an accident that genie, genius, sounds like jinn. Okay, that could be true. But one of the things I think about, and I don't know, because why I question it, because there's all kinds of erasure related to Arabic cultures or other people of color throughout history, when we see like, oh, no, they can't possibly be related. But one of the things that gives me pause is that the jinn act in many ways as we might describe the daemons. How? A couple things. One, every person has a jinn with them, right? And what's fascinating, so for instance, in Islam, when someone dies, we don't feel like their spirit can come back through a medium or whatever. What do Muslims believe? They believe your jinn impersonates you, right? They know you so well, they can take on the trappings of you. Now, that's fascinating, because then that would parallel the idea of an incarnating spirit, a tutelary spirit, that also would know you just as well. The other thing is that they are seen as intermediaries, meaning that they actually can, it's described actually in the Quran, where they used to eavesdrop at the heavens to hear what the angels were bringing to earth from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. right?
Wow.
So it's the same kind of concept as we understand with, the idea of the daemons, in terms of how they're intermediary spirits between the gods in relation to human beings. And then, of course, as Proclus and other people gave us a topography of how there are three intersect, levels of daemons, So that's another thing that's interesting. And then there are good and bad jinn. Sorry. So when we say they're good and bad jinn, that again goes along with the idea in more advanced studies of daemons as well. There's some daemons, and in fact, I don't know, we can make the argument there are no, just to go off track a little bit, there are no bad daemons. What I've been thinking about when we talk about the lowest class of daemons, because humans have the middle class. There's an upper class, they're more celestial, then there's a middle class, and then there's supposedly a lower class that more interacts with the machinations of nature and what's around.
And they're impersonal, right?
Huh?
Would you say that those ones are impersonal?
Yes, they're not as interested in human beings. And what I think happens, and this may have gone toward the interpretations of things related to the church and also in Islam, because they're impersonal, because they're not concerned about human affairs, if they're disturbed by humans, I think they become irate and mischievous. We might even say it goes beyond mischief, and maybe they're interested in things that we would associate with evil. But it's not because they're just looking to foil humans. I think maybe we get in their way, or they're like, you know what, I'm gonna teach this one a lesson. And maybe this is not the one who offended me, but whatever, her daughter will do. And so I think that becomes like where we experience quote unquote demonic possession, all these particular things. And that parallels some thoughts, especially in Islam, related to the jinn, because the jinn, as a class of beings who are separate from angels, which makes more sense to me in the Abrahamic tradition. I'll come back to that if you want me to, but it makes more sense to me. Their issue is with humanity, and understandably, because they're a separate creature from the angels, but they weren't given the earth, right? So it's like, why do these beings, mud packs, these creatures of earth and dirt and water, kind of become the vice regents of the world, and we're not, and we were created before them? Because that's how actually things broke apart. The hosts of heaven were called before Allah to bow before Adam and Eve, and the prince of the jinn, Iblis, also now known as Satan, wouldn't bow, because why would I bow before that that's made of mud and I'm made of fire? And some Sufis make the argument that he was actually a supreme monotheist because he couldn't conceive of doing anything other than honoring the one. So, I mean, in terms of dealing with love, I guess what I'll say, I mean, you didn't ask, but I'll give it anyway. Why does it make more sense to me? Because I'm a former Christian minister. And the idea that an angel who, it's confusing in the Bible whether these are beings who have will or don't have will, would suddenly jump up and say, like, I want to be like the Most High, and want to be God. Why? Right? You've seen close up what the job is like. Do you think you could do better? So it doesn't seem like that makes sense. What made sense, as I understood from the Quran, was that there was this other set of beings who just was like, yeah, this creature you made, I don't think it's worth it. So that would be more the going in line with what I see in Greek and Roman thought related to the genius and the daemon.
Okay, so the jinn are mentioned, would you say, more than once in the Quran?
Way more than once. And one of the things that's fascinating to me is that the jinn predate the Quran, right? So they're not just introduced, they're actually part of the lore of pre-Islamic thought.
That was another thing I came across, and it's like there was no date that I could find that it went back to. It was just like, this is really old. This has been around. Right.
And it's so old. I mean, like, in terms of Semitic thought and specifically Arabic thought, because it covers such a wide swath of land, whether we're talking towards Syria to all the way through the Arabian Peninsula, it's hard to really kind of pinpoint the origins of particular ideas. And there are even precedents. One of the things that I also talked about in that workshop, there are precedents related to the jinn in other cultures, whether we're talking about the Lamassu in Babylonian culture or the Favarashi in Persian culture. There's some parallels, and so it's not unusual to expect that it might have migrated also into the Arabian Peninsula.
Yeah, okay, that's really helpful. And last bit on that is, would you say today, because like I mean, I grew up Catholic and I was taught that I had a holy guardian angel, and so that was, especially as a little kid, that was definitely part of my like reality. Would you say that today, like modern day Muslims, would jinn be a part of your reality, like in a real
Yeah,
way?
that you have, when Muslims, not just jinn, we would say angels too. So one, because the Prophet Muhammad, because there's an incorporation of at least three different, or maybe at least two different ideas here. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam also said that he converted his jinn to Islam, right?
I remember I found some kind of bit of text on this, and I did want to ask you about it, but I'm embarrassed because I've forgotten everything about it. But
It's
I
okay.
did know that um that there was a mention that the
He
prophet,
converted his jinn, right?
yeah, yeah.
So there's one mention of that, but going along with the guardian angel, when you see Muslims in their prayer go Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi, Assalamu alaikum to their right and left shoulders, they're greeting the angels on their shoulders.
Oh wow, nice. Yeah,
So that's the idea, that we also go with the idea that one has a guardian angel,
yeah.
at least two that work with you. And that's fascinating because that also, how that got transmogrified or transformed, however you want to look at it, is I remember, and you probably may remember, I think this a little bit too, growing up, cartoons where they would always show a bad and good angel, a bad, on your right or left side. And so I guess it became a combination of the two ideas, that you have your jinn and then you have your angel, you have your devil, you have your, angel. So I think there's that same kind of concept, now, which is it? If we go back to original Greek thought and the idea of the daemon, it's only one, but maybe there's two, I don't know.
Yeah, and gosh, even the Greeks were arguing about it. I know that Iamblichus didn't believe that you could have a personal daimon who was evil, but that there were, yeah. So, but equally, when we get into the astrology, I think about the places of good and bad spirit, good and bad daimon, and that instantly, when I talk to people about it, you do think of the devil on the shoulder, the angel on the shoulder. How do you understand the places in terms of our experience with the daimon? Because this is the other thing, I'm trying to like look at these different approaches, which you covered in the workshop. So you covered the places, the houses, the lots, and the Almutin, and that's pretty similar to what I've been looking at. So with the places, the way so I'm going to share what I was thinking. So I understand the places as our subjective experience with the daimon. So people experiences that we have, not necessarily descriptive of our personal daimons. How do you see
it? Yeah, that's actually the argument I was making during the workshop, and I hope that was conveyed, because as I was doing research on the quote unquote bad houses, well, first let me go back. I first presented this research at I guess it was the 2018 UAC conference, and I was talking about the houses, the 6th and the 8th and the 12th house. And what I have to tell you, I mean, that's independent of anything else I've said about it, and I'll get to, is that I really do believe that came out of a deep communion with my daemon during that year and that whole time, in thinking about the houses. And it became, I guess, what is the groundswell of some ideas that I'm still continuously developing toward understanding the daemon. And that was kind of the first clue. So the first big chunk in that piece was related to the axis of the 12th and the 6th house. And started thinking about what's commonly said about the 12th house, and then also what Hellenistic writers, astrologers said about it as the house of the bad daemon. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, why would that be? And just kind of trying to rectify what moderns say about this. And then what I was reading from these Hellenistic texts and other understandings, what I came to is what you said, which is it's like a bad trip. You know, when you do LSD or you do acid, whatever, it's not necessarily the acid is bad, but maybe the conditions by which you encounter it, your mind state, all these particular things come as a measure of you dealing with the encounter. So the 12th house becomes that as reflective of the quote unquote bad daemon. And then the good daemon, which comes the very next house, is kind of maybe when you've purged, become clearer, move beyond your fears and all the other dimensions that cloud your perception and encounter with the daemon. You know, it's kind of like when people associate, like I did, astrology with the devil or particular things that really come to bring light in their lives, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's kind of moving from the 12th, those dark encounters, into the brighter encounter of how you might see your guiding light, your guiding tutelary spirit.
Yeah, and looking at the sort of the Wikipedia pages of like eminent individuals, I do think that you read about these 12th house experiences, and I'm sure that they experienced them as really subjectively difficult at the time, but it's also like what they became known for, what we appreciate them for.
Correct.
So okay, so that's places. The lot of daimon, the way I'm understanding that is, or the spirit, is the how of our fate, how the daimon shows itself, or how fate becomes destiny.
Yeah, this, what I would say with the lot of spirit as versus how things are articulated more so for the lot of fortune is, you know, the lot of spirit often gets translated more as where you experience the sense of your will, your intentionality. So there's some aspects of it that are flattened, you know, more a sense of your character. And when I say flattened, it's not always embraced in Hellenistic thought. Like I think if we're reading more Olympiodorus or some other people, it's more seen, not like we would describe it psychologically, but more along the line of character, which I'll come back to because that's a very interesting point of departure that also I contemplate a lot, character related to destiny, as inspired by that quote by Heraclitus. And that quote, just for, you know, your listeners who want to be clear, they may have heard it as character is destiny. Whereas the translation has multiple translations, and anyone can look this up. It's in Wikipedia. One particular translation is that your character is determined by your daemon, right? So
one is destiny.
You know, so there is a way in which, you know, the paradigmatic or dramatic sensibility of who you are is kind of conditioned by your daemon, which makes sense with the myth of in terms of how you selected your lot in life, in terms of who you become. Okay, so when you get back to the lot of spirit, it becomes more a measure of how you encounter what you aspire toward, what in your mind functions as God, right? Toward where you feel the sense of what lifts you. So, you know, and that I think requires more contemplation, and thinking about where that's nestled for you in your consciousness. So I'll give you an example that's more personal that probably can elucidate it. Because I love how you constructed this interview, or, you know, this class, however you want to look at it. And I'll talk more about that toward the end in terms of the layers that we're going in, right? Going toward the Almateen, you know, of the figure, which is, you know, a different layer of it, which, as you read, Iamblichus and Proclus and others debated, like, can we really use these figures in the chart to figure out what your daemon is. I come on a particular side of that, so I'll weigh in on that. But getting to this middle point with a lot of spirit, it definitely augurs this moment where it's more mentally, emotionally contemplative. And for me, when I first saw my lot of spirit and that -3 Cancer in my 5th house, I was like, what does that mean? Right. And I had some resistance to it. I'm not that emotional, blah, 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 things related to the moon. Right. But what I've come to contemplate, and I first discovered that is 2021. I discovered that, I guess, 20 years ago, 2001. So over the years, I've had more time to think about how do I live with this lot of spirit in Cancer, and how it's come alive for me in terms of reflective of my daemon is more related to the things that nurture us, like, yes, being around water. I like long baths, showers. And you may say like, okay, but water, shower is where, going with what you're saying, the how, that somehow space becomes created to encounter my daemon, right? The other thing that surfaces with that is what I also hold sacred. Now, one of the things that's interesting when I say hold sacred doesn't mean, no, you hold water sacred. Okay, maybe. I mean, water is important for everybody. But, things related to Cancer, I find myself also over the years, even though I don't have a close relationship with my family, what's idealized, what becomes the idea of it is family and home, right? So there's a contrast where you have, where you might live it, but then what kind of anchors you is having a sense of home, and what that means in your life. And you might say, like, well, what's that relate to with the broadness of the spirit that incarnates with you? Well, it's kind of telling you where, for lack of a better word, for me, where home is, where's the conditioning influence. Maybe if it were the lot of spirit in Gemini, it would be more moved toward particular books or ideas or communication. Or if my lot of spirit was in Aries, where I may have feel the spirit of Mars in fighting, or the spirit in action in doing something. So as you did say, it is a certain level of how, but not in the mechanistic sense of like instructions, but the conduit, the place by which you may encounter the spirit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's really exciting. If I understand it the way it's going in the same way that the sun and the daimon is like a solar being, it's like the ideal that we hold shapes how we do things. So I've got 5th house lot of daimon as well, but it's in Scorpio, and that's one that I've sort of been trying to explore. But if I'm kind of going through those steps, I would think
it's all around you, though. I mean, like, if I had to just, when I say it's all around you, I mean literally, like right now, I mean, even though I don't have any other information, I don't know where your Mars is, but a 5th house daimon, or a lot of spirit manifesting and looking at the creativity around you in terms of, again, depending on where your Mars is, that will give you more information. But Scorpio is definitely more concerned with, as we might say in Islam, the inner jihad, the way by which we explore the depths of who we are within, and by virtue of that, become more our own selves, right? Where the sense of autonomy, the sense of self-determination, all those things become the hallmark. Because Aries, as the reflective, the diurnal notion of Mars, is more action related to the external world or how we encounter what's before us. Whereas Scorpio also, as a water sign, is tangling more with what's within.
It's a nice counter to the sun in Aries, I think. So
yeah,
that
your sun in Aries.
Yeah. So, and that's quite like 10th house. It's quite dominant in my life. I feel like everything is about that. So learning about the daimon, it's almost like, I don't know. It feels like a kind of counter in a way.
Right. Well, there's a dimension in which you are, dealing with it both up, or out, and then within. Yeah. For instance, I just see your diamond up there. What's the top part of it say? You don't have to show it to me.
Oh, it just says embrace your daimon.
Okay. Right. So there's a way in terms of talking about the embrace. It's, kind of going within. So that's literally manifestation of what your daemon is saying from the fifth house.
Yeah. 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 And again, that what you were saying there about that sense of an ideal. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. Ideal, your aspiration.
Yeah.
Robert Zoller talks about it as what you kind of conceive of or honor as God.
Yes. I like that.
I have some complications in that view, not because I think, obviously, I think that Robert Zoller is wrong. No, it's not. I don't think it can kind of lead to, I think, an erroneous nuance where it's like, oh, then that is what represents singularly as God for you. I think it's better to think about, maybe how you encounter God, right? Or the ways by which you understand the sense of God. I'll give you another illustration of like my daemon that became clear, and it just hit me maybe about a few years ago. So I've gone through different bouts related to what we might talk about as atheism, the absence of belief in God, when I was younger, and then when I was a bit older. And even now, I'm not, even as a Muslim, I don't conceive of God as a singular being. I mean, when I say singular, I think it's one animating presence. I think that's the singularity, but as a measure of like, God looking at me, blah, 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 as personifying, that's not me. But one thing I've never doubted, never kind of put on the table were ancestors, right? Right. I never kind of like, I never questioned whether ancestors are present in our lives. So that may be another way by which the idea of my lot of spirit in Cancer in the fifth kind of shows up as we're, dealing with one's roots, one's family, the dimensions of oneself. That always stays with you. So that's my ideal. That's why I kind of change it from God.
Yeah. Like the highest imaginable thing. And it's like I don't think of fifth house Scorpio as like my God. But one thing that I would say similarly is this idea of God being a creative source. Like that's something that I've never questioned, even when I've been like, okay, I'm done with the Catholic thing. Like that's been an interesting thing. So what you hold with like high esteem, and it's often I think quite hard for people to reflect on that unless they've done some inner work, some real work on that. Yeah. So the Almutine or the Almatane?
I say Almatane. I mean, and this is a conversation. Even someone who participated in that workshop gave me some.
There was a great discussion on that. Yeah.
Gave me some more fodder. Like he came back even with more information. I have to find it, not now, but I'll find it another time. But I can forward it to you. I don't think he would.
That would be helpful. Yeah.
Well, it started when I converted to Islam in October of 2011 and started interacting with more native Arabic speakers. There's two things to know. Well, one, my fantasy, I'm going to call it that, my fantasy in terms of being drawn to Islam was that, this is the religion that also, or the people in that religion who surface so much with astrology. And, Abu Mushar and Al-Kindi, all these other different luminaries. MashaAllah was actually Jewish, but we have these different people from that particular time frame who bring so much to it. And so I was of the mind, that, as I converted to Islam, that, I'll be part of this tradition. Well, the first thing is that Islam, after the fall of Baghdad in 1258, never recovered and became eventually anti-astrological and anti most other forms of knowledge that wasn't based on the Quran or the life of the Prophet Muhammad, right? So as I started talking to more Muslims, I definitely wasn't out as an astrologer for most of them, unless we were close. My imam knew, and he was very open to astrology, but most of the others were not. So I started asking questions about things in astrology, right? The words we use. I was like, hey, have you ever heard of this word, Almutine? No, I don't know what you're saying. No, I mean, it's an Arabic word. I read it in this book, blah, blah, blah. No, right? And I would do that, with different Arabic words, Kazemi, have you heard of this, blah, 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 with different people as we, would have casual conversation. And this one guy, he was what was he? The food trucker. He operated a food truck, and I was asking him about it. He was like, are you trying to say Al-Matin? What do you mean? What does that mean? The strongest, Allah. This is one of the names for Allah, and I was like, oh yeah, I think I'm trying to say Al-Matin. Then I ran home and I was like, okay, got on Google. I was like, maybe this is a mistranslation, and everyone keeps, perpetuating it, because it just didn't make sense. It was like Al-Mutin doesn't even sound Arabic. It's just the Al, right?
Yeah.
So Al-Matin, meaning the strongest, one of the names for Allah, that makes more sense, even though there might be some way we could fine tune it. So what it means for those who are listening, it means at a particular point, a degree. It could be for anything. It'd be for the cusp of the second house, the first house, whatever. It means a planet that registers as the strongest based on compound factors. Now, in the Al-Mutin or Al-Matin of the figure, you're looking at 5 compound factors. Now, this is different from other things that, if you're into medieval astrology, it's easy to confuse the Lord and Lady of the geniture with the Al-Mutin of the figure, which is not the same. The Lady and Lord of the geniture is more taking into account accidental dignity, which is there's an argument for it.
Yes.
So it's going to be what planet is also strongest at a particular angle, right? Rather than being cadent and all these other particular things. Whereas you're looking at just 5, what planet is strongest in these 5 places that you can calculate. Now, when these 5 places, people were like, what are these 5 places? The sun, moon, the ascendant, the syzygy, and then a lot of fortune. The syzygy is a fancy way of saying the lunation before you are born. So if you're born before a new moon, or the new moon happened before you were born, or the full moon happened before you were born, you would use the degree in which that, and then you would find what is the strongest planet at that particular degree, based on 5 different levels of essential dignity. So when you calculate that, you're supposed to come up with what describes as, or believed to describe, like symbolically, the full nature of your daemon, right? Or the interest of your daemon. Now that's different from the lot of spirit, right? Because a lot of spirit becomes more like you framed it. How we might say the conditioning, we might even talk about that as the way by which you connect with your daemon. But when we're talking about it from the Al-Mutin of the figure, it's more how that spirit shows up through the blessings, interest of that planet, right? And what draws to it, despite what might be sometimes your preferences. So I remember I always thought that, I'm more of a Mars boy, I'm a Scorpio, Mars in Capricorn, exalted Mars, Saturn in Aries, in mutual reception. I'm more Mars, I've been a boxer, fighter, if anyone observes me online or on Twitter, I don't shy from a debate or a discussion. But really, my Al-Matin of the figure is Venus. And initially I was just like, come on, how can that be her? Come on. But
the lot in the moon sign, you got the Al-Mutin and Venus.
Yeah, so I'm like, come on, why would that be? But in thinking about my life, whether that's, how I use my voice, or how I've been also a published poet, right? Or these particular things, or even like how I'm doing my home, right? Getting flowers for my garden, all these other things. My friend, a close friend who's known me for like, 30 something years, is like, of course it's Venus, right? What did you think? And it's not just, it's probably when I'm more out of balance or not in communion with my daemon that it might become more Mars. But when I'm in communion, feeling the beauty of Venus. And then Venus is also a complicated figure in, in her trajectory in a lot of ways. Venus, I mean, one of the names for, speaking of Satan, one of the names for Venus is Lucifer, right? Venus was also, as a morning star, honored as a warrior goddess in multiple cultures. So the experience of that sense of Venus is probably something that I should acknowledge, and honoring also the feminine, the idea of the sensual, all these things become important. So if someone else, they encounter, and it's going to be one of the 7 traditional planets, right? It's not suddenly going to be, Uranus or Neptune. I mean, that's not what we do. But it could be Saturn, it could be Jupiter. And then they have to not just have deep contemplation related to it, because it's not so much that that planet becomes your tutelary spirit, but the nature of that.
Yeah.
The one big disagreement that I didn't do during the workshop that is listed for anyone who's interested, it is listed as a method in Henry Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books on occult philosophy. And my friend Eric Perdue is coming out with a newer translation of that in November, if anyone's interested. So I think it's going to be very exciting as versus the standard one that's out now. There's a way in which you could tie the understanding of your good and bad daemon, right? And give it more of a Hebrew name, based on breaking it down by certain planetary signatures. I don't know if I'm a fan of that, because I'm like, well, why would my daemon have to be Hebrew or have a Hebrew name, right? And you may say that may not be literal, but yeah, if it's not literal, then I'd rather do the work of learning my daemon's name from deeper contemplation and encounter. And that gets more into, speaking of the practical, there's a book called Holy Daemon by Frate Aka, who gets more into, you've read it, you're familiar with it?
Brilliant, yeah.
Where
he's dedicated.
What'd you say?
He's very dedicated to meeting the daimon.
Yeah, he was, right? So there's a particular way that he spells out from his particular tradition by which he does it. Now, I'm not advocating for his way, because also I would be hypocritical. I haven't done his way, but I've done my own ways by which, again, it's related to, yes, we could say ritual work. And one of the things I do believe is that you can trust your daemon if you, just like you have any guide, or how you talk about with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or Jesus or Mary or whoever, to kind of guide you toward what would be pleasing in having an encounter with you. How do you direct me? And some things will come to you through your intuition, whether that's through your dreams, waking moments. Like I said, for me, I can turn on water and then that energy starts to flow. So it becomes a way by which you then have this experience that might initially be difficult, the 12th house, and then you come toward the light of the 11th house. And then, Frater, gives particular ways in which, he's talked about it, some ritualistic ideas that people can follow in that book, but you can get as an ebook or you can order it.
Yeah, and this brings up an important point, which is how you approach meeting your daimon. Because for me, I find the technical, the astrological bit really easy, and I love the idea of generating a name based on this calculation. But the thing that keeps coming back to me, and what I think my daimon is trying to tell me, is that for me, for my daimon, what is being demanded of me or requested is actually a move away from the left brain side of things, and moving more towards an intuitive way. So going through a meditation, and I've had really powerful experiences by just giving that a chance. You could even take one of these kind of guided visualizations where it's like you walk into a cave, the daimon's there,
right?
So again, I think different people are going to resonate with different ways of doing this.
And I'm curious, I don't know if you want to talk about this too much with your chart being public. I am curious, just because something you said, your Mercury in Aries or Pisces?
Oh, Aries.
Okay. Okay. Because that makes sense. Because I was like, oh, because I remember from one of our other talks is that, yeah, you talked more about the left brain and you were working with left brain people as you were also moving into astrology. So that makes sense.
Yeah, it's just kind of keeps coming back to that. So yeah, and you mentioned, sorry, I didn't get this clear, the difference between the Almatine and the Lord or Lady of the Geniture. And you said something about the difference between the way you go about finding these planets. So is it essential?
It's an evaluation process. So, so for instance, it's not just the accountancy of how we add up figures with the almutin of the figure, right? It's just like who ends up being the loudest or having the most potency at these 5 zodiacal places. Whereas when we may do some of that with the Lord and Lady of the Geniture, but who's in a better position to be able to deliver the goods related to what they can do by that accountancy. So you have an angular sun. So if your sun was in the running, you know, but let's say it was neck and neck, let's say with Mars, but Mars is in the 8th house, the sun would win, even though let's say Mars even had like a point advantage. The sun is in a better position, it's angular. So that would be more the argument of the Lord and Lady of the Geniture. You might say like, well, that sounds more subjective. It is, right? But that is one aspect of it.
And I guess people, it's funny because my Mars is in the 8th place, but basically people could, I guess, try both techniques. Would you recommend that? And then
sure.
Yeah, it's because that's the other thing. You mentioned how originally like Venus wasn't speaking to you because you didn't maybe see yourself as like a Venusian character.
And she's in the 8th place.
Oh yeah. But basically it's that thing of it's not even meant to be describing us. It's meant to be describing the daimon.
The daimon that's working through us, with us, for us, right?
Yeah.
So that's exactly right. The daimon, and I'm hesitant to say this, but I want to be clear with it, parallels how modern folks have framed the dimension of understanding the quote unquote higher self. My problem with that, why I'm being very careful, is the daemon is not yet yourself also, right? It is also a separate, you know, you might say it's a symbiotic relationship, a symbiote. You know, one of the things that's interesting in Star Trek is that they've been working with the idea of some civilizations having a symbiote, you know, a symbiotic relationship. So it has a legacy independent of your own history, but it's kind of incarnated with your history. And that does become an interesting dialogue with the modern mind, with the ancient mind. And that's kind of the contrast, because we've done a lot of work in the last century to kind of deal with the containment and framing of self, you know, for good or for bad. And I think, you know, as contrast to our predecessors and our ancestors, they saw a lot more operating beyond them. Now, some may say like, well, they were just wrong. It was more their collective unconscious or unconscious. That's where I have my decisive break with modern thinking.
Yeah. Did you mention the book by C.S. Lewis in The Discarded Image in your
No.
No. Okay. That's an interesting book on like how medieval thought is so different to our thinking now, and makes me think of that.
I haven't read that book. So it's Discarded Image. I have read C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
But
that's really interesting.
I haven't. Okay, I will look.
And he's got stuff on the daimon in it, even.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Yeah, definitely. I mean, which would be important related to his work, that we can see manifest in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So that makes sense. Yeah, especially with what he's written.
Exactly. And I did have a question about the Almutin, the Almatine. Sorry, so that's older than Agrippa, right? It's an older technique.
Yes. I mean, it's older than Agrippa, and it's, yeah, because I remember that is one of your questions. So I don't think it has, even though the idea of coming up with the kurios, who's in charge of the soul, these are concepts that was in Hellenistic astrology, in terms of who has particular authority, but I think that was also more by accidental dignity.
Yeah.
One of the things that surfaced more in medieval periods was, looking for who was the strongest and using the essential dignities for tabulation, and counting them up. So that became more of a thing in the medieval period. So technically the idea of Almutin as the strongest, as manifested by counting up who's the strongest at particular points, that is more medieval. But the concept of who's steering the soul, who are these particular, that has its roots in Hellenistic thought.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing that I hadn't thought about in itself, which is how much weight do we put on accidental versus essential dignity? And that would be an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah, I mean, the downside of how we've learned now to assign particular numbers is that we take them too literally, rather than suggestively. It's kind of like, so forgive me for using the imperial system, like when we're driving. I know you guys are, you're using in meters, but if you see a sign that says 50 miles per hour, right? If you're going 48, if you're going 52, you're within the speed limit. Even if you're going, I think here in the States, 55 miles per hour, you're still within the speed limit. It's like when you go to 60, whatever. So it's just a way of kind of gauging things. Not so much getting like, my Mars is a 6 or 12. It conquers everything. It's like, okay.
It sort of objectifies the planets in a weird way. I guess that's one way of.
That's a way. I never thought to put it that way, but yes, it does.
I've always sort of seen those like, those numbers. Also, just a fun little fact. I think in continental Europe, they definitely say like kilometers, but in England, we're still saying miles. So
okay.
On that. Yeah.
Okay.
It's our like secret that we don't let people know. We think we're all like good for using.
I thought you were metric too, right?
Oh yeah, not with road stuff. Anyway, okay. So remediation. This is a really interesting part of the talk. Something I hadn't really considered even, and it's still something very new to me. I've looked at Andrea Gertz's work on remediation, but did you have any like people or places to look for that?
She's an interesting, point to start. And why I say interesting, that's not like even, any slight toward Andrea or whatever. It's more so because I have her book on my shelf and I've read that too. I say it's interesting because she has been a student of Judith Hill, and Judith Hill straddles between two worlds. And again, I don't mean that in any disrespectful way. She knows and has studied the medieval world, but she's also immersed in the modern, right? And so the remediations that I found helpful in astrological remediation by Andrea Gertz is that they're very, I wouldn't say psychological, but practical, but very modern in terms of how you might deal with particular issues related to configurations in your chart or particular points. When we're talking on the level of the daemonic, in terms of remediation, there's a couple different layers by which we can start to address them. One is on the level of magic. Now, let me just say it forthrightly. You probably heard me say it in the workshop. I don't practice magic anymore, right? But when I say I don't practice magic, meaning I don't do the work of setting up magical images and magical work. That doesn't mean I don't use them. I have a talisman from Christopher Warnock, works wonders, it's great, blah, blah, blah. So one can do things on the level of using magic, whether you do it or you have it done, right? And so, if you're having trouble with, in terms of remediation, a particular problem, whether that's money, or we're talking about having a greater sense of alignment with your daemon, right? Say, the figure turns out to be Mars. I'm making up something now. You don't have to say it. It says, it's Mars. Then you might, there's two different theories about how one might remediate, especially if Mars is in a compromising position by sign or by position. So it may be that some will say, then just have a way in which you may have Mars in a stronger position, using a Mars in Aries talisman or something like that. Some are the other school of thought, where you would go toward the polar opposite, toward Venus as a way of soothing and helping out your Mars.
Yeah.
I think you have to kind of, one, be open to some measure of experimentation and where your gut is on that. Because I think, I can see the wisdom of both in different situations. The other is mantras. So for me, I don't use mantras, right? Because I'm a Muslim and I don't necessarily need to appropriate someone else's culture for that. I can do du'as, particular du'as related to, for instance, with some work I was doing with Austin Coppock related to making some amends with my brother, I would do particular du'as and prayers on Venus days. Mm. So that's another particular thing. It's during Venus hours, right? Yeah. So there are particular magical things that you can do that are apart from the psychological that we were talking about with Andrea Gertz. Then there are particular things that you can get, oils that you can wear. Then there can be simple remediations. If you want to get more in touch with the Jupiter, you might wear Jupiter saffron clothing, right? You want to get more in touch with your Mercury, especially related to a Mercury day. Maybe you might wear green, or you might wear some other color on Mercury days, or pay more special attention to Hermes and the idea of Hermes with images. And this is where it's an interesting contrast with Islam, something I struggle with, and I'm owning this as struggle. In Islam, there's this idea, yes, honor the one God. But I often think, because I have studied theism, I've studied different aspects of religion. There is sometimes this misconception that, if I have a particular, not even idol, an image, I'm worshiping that. But I don't think, any polytheists, especially those who are quote unquote pagans, call themselves pagans out there, I don't believe you believe that you're worshiping an image, right? It's like, oh yeah, this is God right here. It's more so a way by which we have communion with the divine through that image. Similarly, how we were talking about almost with the lot of spirit, right? It becomes a conduit. So I think that also can be helpful in terms of what hones your consciousness toward a particular direction that you want to go as the arc of remediation. Now, remember, the daemon works on the level of daemonic reality or spirit. So it can, we often think in the West that it has to be all our work. One thing that as a Catholic, I know as a Muslim, is that there's elements of grace and some measure of where the God or God is willing to work with you by demonstration of your willingness to work with the God, right? So I think that is helpful. A book that deals with this, I don't think it's just on the level of remediation, but definitely related to the idea of the healing of the soul. I've really gotten into the work of Tim Addy. Are you familiar with his work? You know him?
No.
Okay. And it's fascinating how I discovered him, or, encountered him. I wouldn't say I discovered that because I didn't discover him. Encountered his work. So the first book I read of his was 7 Myths of the Soul. And then the other one is The Path of Perfection, which is looking at Neoplatonic thought. And Tim Addy, why I think this, and he's in England, he's in, he's over there. Tim Addy is the son of John Addy. And okay, who's John Addy? John Addy is one of the preeminent astrologers who kind of paved the way related to harmonic astrology and getting into the levels of harmonics. So I can't imagine that the son didn't grow up with some understanding and relationship with the father, even though he's not focused on being an astrologer at all, right? but he's looking at the particular myths as a way by which we have this development in relation to the soul of going through the many, which are the different gods, and even through the daemon toward the one, which is at the heart of Neoplatonic thought. So that might be a way for people to also look at, because he also has some practical exercises and some thoughts by which you can start to engage these myths as a way of not Jungian integration, because Jungian integration, my problem with the psychological dimension that has also come into astrology is that it's kind of a quiet atheism, right? And what I mean by that, and somebody say like, well, what's the problem with that? And that's fair. That's a fine argument. It's a quiet atheism where it's trying to acknowledge the numinous and the mysterious without acknowledging that it's also something that's beyond our comprehension. Yeah. Which is how the gods were thought of. You know, how we see, you know, like the 12th house became the unconscious rather than the account of the bad daemon. Yeah. And I started having questions about that. Like, what is the unconscious? You know, is it is it a location in the mind? Right. Is it just what we kind of give as the nomenclature for this broadness of anything that seems to be beyond our awareness? What actually is it? Which our ancestors kind of would probably allocate it more to the parameters of the daemonic, the gods, you know, what was beyond them, which also gives a certain personal encounter, right? Supplication, all these things, prayer, all these things that kind of, I think, bring out the best of the human being. Whereas what we've observed with the ascendancy of centering the psyche, centering the unconscious, it's all on you, sis, right? Yeah. You have to do it. Not dealing with the aspects of grace and how something's also working with you, but, you know, your therapy, you know, all these things. And I'm like, that's a lot of damn pressure. Yeah. And is it working?
And didn't it even, that phrase that Jung said, like, the gods have become our diseases. It's like, he didn't want that. Like, he didn't want us to just start internalizing things. And that's what we've done. Yeah, I'll definitely check out. Is it Tim ADI?
ADDEY.
Brilliant. No, that's going to be really interesting. And
I really have loved his work. And then it's a rabbit hole because they have a whole foundation. And then they're talking about even 19th century, I think even 18th century texts that are also, you know, breaking down and encountering, engaging Iamblichus, Proclus, all these other thinkers. So
great. Perfect. And I think, okay, so Sam, thank you for your time. This has been really, really helpful. If you've just got a couple more minutes, what research would you like to see done on the daimon? If, you know, if this is an area of research that you're still looking into? And
well, one of the things that I touched on, but I didn't quite encounter or fully, I am more of the mind that the daemon, your genius is not necessarily you. Yeah. But I still wonder, I remember I had a vision years ago that, you know, or it was maybe a thought or whatever, but I asked what, you know, I perceived to be my daemon, like, who are you? And it came to me as like, I am you from the end of your life, right? So I'm sent back.
Yeah.
Right? I'm sent back. And I was like, and I've seen permutations of that in various memes, like it's in Menace to Society, that film, you know, because it's told retroactively from, you know, I guess I gave a spoiler. But then but then one particular interesting book that I read, also one of your countrymen, Anthony Peake, Peake, he wrote a book on the daemon. And he's also encountering it from a neuroscience, I mean, he's not a neuroscientist, but neuroscientistic, I wouldn't say scientific because some people critique it that it's not completely science, but he's trying to perceive it in a very nonpartisan, I would say, atheistic or agnostic sense of what is the daemon. And he's making a similar argument to some degree, that it could be ways by which we have the encounter of our consciousness, either from the end of our lives or a particular point, and how that shows up. And then Patrick Harper, who you may be familiar with, he wrote Daemonic Reality, and also a novel, a very long novel, which called Mercurius, where he also deals with the idea of the daemon. Also has this particular thing. So the research that I'm wondering about, well, what is the neuroscientific aspects that we might understand? Because here's what's kind of surfaced. The more I do more work, and I'm an astrologer, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'm trying to educate myself more about neuroscience and reading different books related to that. But one thing that's been fascinating in discovering more about neuroscience is that, and again, I'm not one of those people who believes at this point the mind is the brain, right? So we are talking about something larger. But one thing that's surfacing related to the dominance of Jungian thought and Freudian thought in astrology and in our general, milieu, is recognizing that what Freud or Jung said about how the mind works or the brain works isn't necessarily corroborated by the science, right? You have more modular thinking in terms of what you call your unconscious than it being like a repository that's singular, right? It's almost like we're unpacking a whole different level of theism related to the quote unquote unconscious. And when we unpack the theism, we realize that there were many gods, many stories, many different ways by which we understand what seems to be a continuous, contiguous articulation of history. So it's the same way in which we're dealing with the mind. Now, I don't think we're going to discover in that what the daemon is, but I am curious, as much as I've been more into magic and spirituality, what is the correlation related to what we're seeing in science? And is there something that might be similar? So I was fascinated by Peake's book, even though I wasn't satisfied with his conclusions.
Yeah.
So that's one aspect of research. I guess, I'm curious to see Eric Perdue's new translation of whether he clears up particular things with what Cornelius Agrippa has said. He's written on that, and particularly in terms of dealing with one's tutelary spirit, how that might correlate to living tradition. So one interesting thing about Eric that I find fascinating, to my knowledge, Eric is a white man. I don't know his ethnic origin in terms of where his family's from or whatever, but he is an initiate, and I think even a priest in African traditional religion. And why that's significant, because I know in that particular tradition he's initiated, Yoruba, excuse me, in that particular tradition, you do have a particular god or Orisha who is your guide, who is, the ruler of your head, your Oba. Now, that tradition is still living, even, you're, I think, a lapsed former Catholic. I don't know how you might define yourself. The idea of the saints and how we have the correlation with the saints, that is something that is extant in Catholicism, even how we give particular names. So it'll be interesting to see the research by how we can connect the idea of the daemon to, religious models, whether that's from the Yoruba, which is a living tradition, the Catholic tradition, all these things. Because one of the things as a, former Protestant that I've come to respect very much in terms of the Christianity of Catholicism, because Protestants don't respect the Christianity of Catholicism, is that there's more of a direct lineage into antiquity from Catholicism than Protestantism could ever muster. In fact, where we might have the more growing divorce between the natural world and our encounter with the demonic might start as an articulation related to Protestantism than Catholicism. Some measure, it's almost like the Catholics tried to have a compromise in terms of like, oh, let's have a bridge. Protestants is like, it's only Jesus. That's all you need, and didn't really encounter the demonic unless it comes in weird ways, like one's interpretation of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
But it's not personal.
No, totally. I agree with both of those research areas. It's like you've got one on one side of the spectrum and one on the other. And I think that's really fascinating.
That's how my mind works, right?
Yeah.
Kind of like, it's left and it's trying to integrate left and, because I think both have something to instruct us, and we can learn from both. I mean, there's, science can teach us where we've centered our faith, perhaps in a way that doesn't open up for more encounter with the mystery. And religion is where we encounter ourselves in dimensions of culture and the things that are numinous, that that resonate with us, that go beyond the pale of what's empirical.
Thank you, Sam. I'm going to have to listen back to this and transcribe it. And
I'll listen to. I'll send it back to you as soon as I'm done. I'm going to stop the recording now. Is that okay? Or is anything else you want to say?
No, that's perfect. Thank you. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did, and you check out Sam's work. And you can also find out more about my upcoming book, Discovering Your Personal Daimon. It's currently being launched as part of a Kickstarter campaign. So when you check out the book and support the book and get yourself an early bird copy of it, you can also pick up things like a companion workbook, which you can work through as you go through the astrology section of the book. There are also online courses on the daimon, as well as one-to-one daimon readings with me, coaching sessions, and much, much more. So find out more about that at the link below in the description. And thanks again for all your support. All right, take care and see you next time.